So Terence Crawford has officially become a four-weight world champion and defeated Israil Madrimov at the BMO Stadium in LA, home of an MLS team called LAFC, to win the WBA Super Welterweight / Junior Middleweight 154-pound title. He won the fight via unanimous decision. This was Crawford in his 41st professional fight, going for another belt to add to his already long list of trinkets, having won 9 belts, I believe, previous to this point, the WBO 135-pound title, and consolidating the 140 and 147-pound belts. This fight was very interesting. Now, I said before this fight on Twitter, on different little shows or whatever, that Madrimov was being a little bit underrated going into this fight. I did expect him to be a troublesome fight for Crawford, or at the very least an awkward out, because one thing about Madrimov is I have been following basically his entire professional career. He turned pro in late 2018, and he turned pro against Vladimir Hernandez, who is one of the better gatekeepers at the 154-pound division, which is one of the most impressive professional debuts I've seen in a very long time. He fought I guess not as proven at the time, but a very capable gatekeeper, a guy who's beaten ex-champions such as J-Rock and other guys like that. And he went in there and basically beat the hell out of him. He stopped him in 6 rounds and dropped him twice, I think. I'm not exactly too sure. But he was dominant in that fight. And from then onwards, he had some good performances, and he had a knack for being very flashy, using a lot of showmanship and a lot of showboating. But eventually, around his 6th professional fight, he fought Eric Walker during the pandemic. This fight was on the undercard, I think, of a Cecilia Brækhus fight, but I can't remember who exactly she fought. But I just remember him having trouble in that fight. Walker was giving him issues. Madrimov seemed to tire in the early rounds, and Walker was able to actually stun Madrimov a few times. Madrimov ended up hitting Walker with an overhand right and basically knocking Walker out, but the referee incorrectly ruled it a slip and gave Walker 5 minutes to recover, to which it then went the distance. But a lot of questions were posed around Madrimov, saying that he was extremely unrefined, that he was going to struggle to make the adaptation to the professional ranks. He further had some issues in his subsequent fight against Emeny Colombo. This was on the undercard of his compatriot Akhmadaliev against Rios. He had trouble in this fight. He was buzzed a couple of times. But those were the 2 fights that were necessary, in my view, for him to finally make that transition to the professional ranks. Madrimov was definitely raw coming into the pros, and he still is to an extent at this point. But he's taken the right steps, he's developed the right way, he's taken the right risks, and it has made him a much better, much more effective professional for it. He went on to fight Michel Soro, who I picked Michel Soro to beat him despite his inactivity, and I was wrong. Madrimov pretty thoroughly outboxed Soro, although the stoppage was extremely controversial. I did a video about it back then, I believe, after the fight. And then he fought Michel Soro in a rematch, to which he cut him. And the fight was ruled a technical draw. I don't exactly remember if it was I don't remember if it was a head clash or an actual punch. I remember maybe thinking it was actually a punch, but regardless, according to the rules in the UK, it wasn't a no contest. They ruled it a draw. So Madrimov would go on to fight Igbokwe, to which he looked pretty poor in that fight. He seemed to tire out in that fight too. One thing about Madrimov is he does tend to blow hot and cold. He has some great performances. He does have a high level of skill, but in other fights it doesn't seem like he takes his conditioning as seriously, and he does seem to struggle with intensity in certain fights more than others. But nevertheless, he went on to fight Kurbanov, who himself got a gift against Michel Soro, and he beat the hell out of him. Thoroughly dominated the first 4 rounds and managed to stop him in the 5th, to which he then ended up with the WBA 154-pound belt. He got it vacant in that fight, and he got his shot against Terence Crawford, coming off of a signature victory against Errol Spence for undisputed at welterweight. So I did expect Madrimov, who has a very unique style, who's explosive, who's quick-handed, and who is pretty powerful, to be a troublesome fight for Crawford. And this fight was pretty troublesome for Crawford. Now, I didn't watch the fight on the night it actually occurred. I actually just watched it a few hours ago because Eminem performed for an hour, and I decided that I prioritized my sleep over watching the fight. I'd watched all the rest of the undercard fights from before then, but I didn't really... I wasn't going to bother. I didn't want to stay up till 2 a.m. I had to be up at about 6:30. Regardless, so this fight started off... Madrimov, and this is criticism of Madrimov for this, that people have been levying towards Madrimov for his performance in this fight, in which I myself have against him, which is the fact that he was extremely, extremely tentative, particularly for the first 6-7 rounds. The first 3 rounds, really the first 4 rounds to tell you the truth, I gave Crawford all of the first 4 rounds. Maybe round 3 you could argue could have gone Madrimov's way. It was a pretty close round. But Crawford was doing more. His work was extremely sporadic. He wasn't doing a whole lot, but nor was Madrimov. Madrimov was not jabbing enough. He wasn't jabbing his way in. He was looking to counter. He was looking for Crawford to try to stand his ground, and both were waiting on each other to lunge. Madrimov probably watched his fight against Kavaliauskas, in which Kavaliauskas made Crawford tentative early, to which Crawford basically got impatient and overeager and lunged in and got caught with the right hand. I suspect Madrimov was trying to do the same thing, but so was Crawford, which made the fight a relatively dull and quiet first few rounds, or really first half of the fight. But it wasn't until round 5 to where Madrimov, even though his output was still very conservative, he was able to actually start getting through to Terence. I gave Terence the 5th round. I gave Madrimov the 6th round, or maybe I gave Crawford the 6th round too, and then I think I gave Madrimov the 7th round. It was something like that, but I do remember I had it 5 rounds to 2 after the first 7 rounds. But then it was rounds 8 and 9, where Crawford, either he got tired, or he decided to have a change in tactics, because one thing about Crawford is he does, to a certain extent, prioritize the crowd, especially at this point in his career. Now, before he reached world level, and really up until the Postal fight, which coincidentally was the last fight he actually went the distance, he wasn't really as worried about not entertaining the crowd and not utilizing a lot of showmanship. He was a guy who was willing to get the job done and spoil, or maybe be conservative with his output and use his legs a lot. But nowadays, especially I think that since his legs have started to slow down, he's a guy who kind of likes to get in. I mean, he always has been kind of scrappy, but he knows how to entertain the crowd, let's just say. And from around the 8th rounds onwards, he started to hold his feet, and that gave Madrimov more opportunities. Both guys excel when they have opponents right in front of them. They both like to circle their opponents. They like to move laterally, or they both like to just stand parallel with each other in the pocket. But when Crawford was standing still, that gave Madrimov more opportunities to use his feet, which got him into more of a rhythm. That is where he excelled versus Michel Soro and had his career best performance, and that's where he was able to swarm Crawford. He also got a bit more courageous in there. He started throwing some of those off-balance, kind of awkward hooks, where he would come around at different angles and circle the ring on Crawford. He was a little bit more daring in his approach and in his attacks, and that allowed for him to get more success. And I think it threw Crawford off, and because of all of the posturing and the feinting from Madrimov, it made the timing in this fight very awkward for Crawford to get down. It was almost a similar situation, I think, to the Jose Benavidez fight, and even to an extent the Kavaliauskas fight. A guy who's conservative with his output but utilizes a lot of feinting, looks for specific shots. Sometimes Crawford can be lured into their game. Sometimes his output can drop with theirs, and he himself isn't really a natural pressure fighter. He does have to sacrifice a lot of his defensive responsibility to get close to opponents and pressure them. And that was kind of the case in this fight. And in the 8th and 9th rounds, I thought Madrimov had his best rounds of the fight. Round 10 was a pretty even Steven round, but that's where the tide started to turn. Crawford started getting into more of a flow. He himself started to step outside of his comfort zone and throw more combinations. Well, I shouldn't even say his comfort zone. He is good in those types of fights, and he does like to get into tear-ups to a certain extent. But he started to kind of do away with his more safety-first approach. He started fighting more mid to close range, And that was the turning point of the fight, because in the last 2 rounds, I mentioned previously that Madrimov has had some issues with stamina, like for example in the Eric Walker fight. And while he has definitely acclimatized himself to the intensity of championship fights and going long in fights, Crawford, his experience far supersedes Madrimov's, and Madrimov in the last 2 rounds did not have enough for Crawford. He was using his feet, but he was not committing to his shots in the same way. So Crawford was putting punches together, he was working Madrimov's body, and those short left hands to Madrimov's solar plexus, which he was landing all throughout the fight, and which were his most effective punches during the fight, were able to take their toll, even though he wasn't able to visibly stun Madrimov throughout the fight. So the last 2 rounds, Crawford took both of them. I had the 10th round even, so what that leads to effectively is a 7 rounds to 4 and 1 even scorecard in my view for Terence Crawford. I thought there were a couple of swing rounds. I think the most generous score you could have for Madrimov is 5 rounds, and the most generous the most generous scorecard you could have in Crawford's favor is 9 rounds to 3. So overall, there are some people claiming that this was some type of robbery. To be honest, I thought this was a close fight. You could have had it 7 rounds to 5, which would have meant only 1 round could have swung the result of the fight on my scorecard, I suppose, if you were to give the swing round to Madrimov. But overall, I do think this was a clear-cut victory for Crawford. The margins were small, but the margins were noticeable. So Crawford now becomes a titleist in his 4th weight category. Overall, this is a very good showing, I think, from Madrimov. This is a fight that I think will, I don't like to use this term because a lot of times people use it and just completely ignore context. But I do think this is a victory that could potentially age well for Crawford. And I do think Madrimov is capable of beating pretty much anybody else in the division as long as he's on his game, as long as he's on his A game. Because sometimes, he does tend to drop the ball and lose focus in fights, and that's where opponents capitalize on him. Crawford, I think, is capable of beating anybody in this division, but I think this is probably his limit. I think he'll probably be too small to be able to beat a Janibek at a 160, though he does have the skill to be able to outbox him. I think he should set his sights on trying to clear out this division. I think the Canelo talks are unrealistic unless he's looking for a quick payday. If we're looking at the rest of the undercard, I'll just give some quick takes. I thought Miller beat Ruiz. I thought he won 8 rounds to 4. It was 2 hippopotamuses boxing each other, except Ruiz has no dedication whatsoever to his craft. He was inactive. One concern I expressed about Ruiz was the fact that despite the fact that he was in a low output, low intensive fight against Luis Ortiz, he gassed extremely hard, and there were particular points in that fight where even Ortiz looked the more youthful of the two. And that did not bode well against a guy like a Israil Miller, who, as limited as he can be, and the fact that he's been cleaned up, let's just say, he's persistent, he has a good chin, and, all he basically did was just Homer Simpson Ruiz, and he deserved to win the fight. Ruiz had nothing after the 4th round. Apparently he broke his hand in the 5th, and, I did see he broke his hand, he definitely did, but he ain't got no stamina, he ain't got no discipline. To an extent, you could say he's a waste of talent, but I mean, let's be real. If he shed off all that weight, he'd probably be like 210, 220 pounds, man. I don't know when it comes to Ruiz. He should either rematch Miller or, I don't know, he can go sell Twinkies or some shit. Forget about that. Morel boxed against Hot Rod Kaladzic, and he didn't look particularly impressive in that fight. He struggled with Kaladzic's movement. He is a good fighter. I didn't think he'd have as much as in the tank as he had, even though he has put up valiant efforts against the likes of Beterbiev. I thought he deserved to beat Brown several years ago, and he did just beat the hell out of Barrera. But Morel did look underwhelming, even though I do think he deserved to get the victory. Andy Cruz had a slightly troublesome fight against Antonio Moran, but he did manage to get the stoppage. Cruz is in a similar phase, in my view, to what Madrimov is in right now, to where he's having to kind of do away with the flash. He is undersized for the 135 and 140 pound divisions when you compare him to his contemporaries and his peers in the weight class. So he's going to have to be very careful, and he's going to have to be reticent to a certain extent. He's going to have to be, cautionary, I suppose, in the ring, and circumspect. He he cannot take too many risks, especially when the margin of errors is that small, and he does have a short window to succeed, even though I rate him very highly. We have Valenzuela, who completely outboxed. Now, this is the one fight I was wrong about. He completely outboxed and outclassed Isaac Cruz. I didn't think he was capable of boxing as well as he did, but I did think Cruz would be able to get inside. I didn't think Valenzuela would be able to box the way he did for 12 rounds, but all he did was just use his lateral movement, stick a jab in his face, and he outboxed him for 12 rounds. Cruz had nothing. Well, I mean, he landed some power shots, but he really didn't do anything to him. Cruz struggles with movement, but Valenzuela, for his part, is a much more coordinated, more athletically gifted fighter than somebody like a Cabrera, who relies so much on his holding and doesn't really have the power to get Cruz's respect. Cruz looked very basic, and to tell you the truth, he should probably move down to 135. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on the card. I thought it was a pretty solid card. Bakole versus Anderson. Anderson got completely shown up by Bakole. I picked Bakole to win the fight by stoppage. I thought maybe if Anderson could take the shots, he could maybe, win out on exchanges, but I didn't feel like he would be able to. Bakole has had trouble with quick-handed fighters in the past, like a Michael Hunter and people like that, but Anderson doesn't have the speed of foot nor the defensive responsibility, and he also fought he fought a very nervous fight. He fought very scared, not in the sense that he was completely unwilling to exchange, but you could tell that a lot of the energy that he was exerting in the ring after that knockdown was nervous energy. He saw a big, basically battering ram just charging after him, and he knew he was pretty much out of options. He had to just let his hands go and hope something stuck. And Bakole took everything he had. He had no respect for Anderson, and he just basically ran him over. Bakole could be a formidable heavyweight. I just think he needs to lose some of that weight, because he was huffing and puffing after the first 2 or 3 rounds. Luckily for him, his style does not require much, intensity and movement and high levels of exertion. He's just so gifted in the sense that he's so strong and powerful. And that was more than enough to demolish Jared Anderson, who had nothing for him, really, even though he did land some good shots. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the card. Let me know what you all think. Have a good one.